Good evening. I'm here to talk to you tonight about how technology, the seemingly impersonal technology, has affected in a great way our ability to access excellence, excellence in thinking, excellence in performance practice, and knowledge. Now, why is this so important? Well, I'll tell you why. There are a couple of things you need to know about musicians. The first one, which you probably already know, that is, we musicians like to practice. Practice, practice, practice. In fact, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice! But there's something else you might not know about us musicians, and that is that we musicians are also detectives. We're always trying to uncover information that will allow us to learn a bit more about the music we're playing. We're trying to inform ourselves either with some technical knowledge to help us play something better, or to help us to gain a clearer understanding of what the composer's original intention was. Let me give you an example. Well, we all know about Johann Sebastian Bach, and you heard one beautiful example of one of his many, many solo violin pieces that was so beautifully played just now by a New World Symphony fellow, Mircea Lazar. Thank you, Mircea. But what you may not know about Bach is that, in fact, for a period of about 100 years after his death, his music was basically unknown. You see, until Mendelssohn, the composer Mendelssohn, sort of rediscovered and put forth a tremendous amount of efforts to bring Bach's music back to the forefront in working with researchers and things, people didn't know about his music. In fact, music itself is nothing but bits and pieces of code. It's dots and dashes and some sort of scratchings and a few comments on pieces of paper, all of which are very fragile. So what we attempt to do as musicians is to understand what the composer is trying to do, what he might have heard when he was writing for a particular musician, but it's not always knowable. And certainly we'll never have the opportunity to hear Johann Sebastian Bach play the organ, for example. He was a renowned organ soloist, but we'll never know how he sounded on his own music. We'll also never know even what tempos, or tempi, that is, how fast one of his pieces ought to be. Many musicologists make careers out of arguing, should this tempo be 20 beats per minute faster or slower than someone else's perception. To give you one more example of the efforts that we take to uncover information, something that has been accelerated, the discovery of information by the internet, let me dial back a little bit to one of my musical ancestors, Gottfried Reicher. This portrait contains two very important pieces of code. Now, typically when you're looking at a painting, you might think, well, you know, sort of an interesting-looking fellow holding some odd-looking instrument in his right hand and a scrap of paper in his left hand. But in fact, a tremendous amount of musical detective work was put into place to try to access the information within this painting. This is the only portrait of Johann Sebastian Bach's favorite trumpet player, who was not just a great trumpet player, but also not a bad composer. In fact, he wrote 122 fanfares for this solo trumpet, only one of which remains. And our access to this particular piece of music would have been lost forever were it not for the fact that the portrait painter himself was a very accurate and a highly precise painter. So some researchers looked at the trumpet and looked at the music, and those two pieces of information were used to discover some very important material, some knowledge that helped us carry forward our tradition of Baroque trumpet playing. By the way, the scrap of the piece of paper you see in Gottfried Reicher's left hand sounds like this. Thank you, Travis Peterson. Thank you. Well, probably quite a few of you recognize that piece if you wake up relatively early on Sunday morning and tune into CBS. Mind you, I'm not an employee of CBS. I'm not pitching the network. But were it not for those dedicated efforts, we'd never have access to that particular piece of information. But the remarkable transformation that has taken place with the advent of the internet and internet-based technologies in the last decade or so has accelerated the process by which we can access excellence of ideas. It's not, YouTube has come a long way in a very short time. I remember the point in time when I was talking to some friends and they said, hey, there's this cool, interesting new place called YouTube. By the way, I saw this guy putting Altoids in a Coke bottle and recording them exploding. And that was like one of the early hits on YouTube. A couple of years later, though, I noticed something very interesting as I, in my trumpet playing life, was playing a recording session at George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch studios. Suddenly, there were a lot of musicians who were 50, 60 years old talking about, hey, did you check that out on YouTube? I saw Henrik Schering playing something, a very famous violinist whose work is well regarded among violinists, but maybe not so well known in the popular culture, shall we say. And then other people started tuning into this. And immediately, it was apparent how powerful the fact that this knowledge is present on the net can be. Speaking of YouTube, in addition to the wonderful opportunity I have to work here with an extraordinary staff and group of fellows at the New World Symphony, I've also had the privilege of working on the first and second YouTube Symphony projects. In the middle of my own detective work, looking at the musicians who were involved with the YouTube Symphony, I found an extraordinary young violinist, and I'm going to share his story with you about how he is using the internet and technology to inform himself from a very remote point in northern Argentina. His name is Stefan, and here's his story.
Mi papá siempre apostó todo a nosotros. Estábamos viviendo en Ucrania, cerca de Chernóbil. Yo me estaba enfermando mucho, mi papá también, el clima no nos sentaba bien, entonces decidimos hacer un cambio. Un gran cambio que nos cambió la vida. Ir a otro mundo prácticamente, estar en Argentina. Empecé a tocar con mi mamá. Yo no voy a ninguna escuela de música, practico con mi mamá, pero también el maestro tiene límites. Uno no puede aprender más que el maestro, a menos que se salga de esos límites. ¿Con quién voy a estudiar? Pongo toda mi carrera en manos de internet. Son como maestros, músicos que ya no viven, pero que dejaron obras grabadas, todavía capaz en blanco y negro. Aprendo con ellos, trato de incorporar de cada uno un poco a mi propia interpretación. Yo cuando aprendo una obra nueva, yo la posteo a YouTube. Me gustaría hacer eso, que la gente me conozca, que sepa quién soy, que sepa lo que hago y que me aprecie.
It's a very powerful story about how a 14 or 15-year-old young violinist from Salta, Argentina, has been able to inform and to learn using the internet as his own personal tool, and as well how he's able to reach out and find his own audiences. Now, Stefan's story was one of more than 100 extraordinary stories I came into contact with during the YouTube Symphony Orchestra project in Sydney, Australia. Here you see the orchestra on the steps of the Sydney Opera House with their artistic director, Michael Tilson-Thomas, also our artistic director. The week was an extraordinary week of master classes, lessons, people who had gotten to know each other somewhat over the internet, communicating before the week-long summit, sharing ideas, sharing personal stories, working with their teachers online was something, it was really extraordinary to be able to arrive in Sydney and to see the meeting for the first time of these people who had gotten to know each other online. Now, the concert itself was a beautiful event. Not only did the orchestra sound fantastic, people from over 30 countries were members of this orchestra, and they put everything together in such an extraordinarily quick way, and were listening to each other, playing music, and that celebrated the whole range of music within Western classical music. As you can see, the Opera House itself was also transformed visually. It was a wonderful celebration of this kind of intersection of music and design and let's see, audio, this beautiful, there was a beauty that was really unparalleled. I lack words to describe it. You really had to be there. Now, not only was the inside of the hall transformed, but the outside of the hall as well. The sails of the Sydney Opera House, hundreds and hundreds of feet high, were transformed into these kind of living, breathing pieces. What was happening on the inside of the hall was projected onto the outside, and what was going on the outside also was moving on the inside. So it was like this extraordinary kind of animal almost. The thing really came to life. But I wanted to point something out to you as well. As wonderful as this particular week was, I'd like you to take a look around where you happen to be right now. Where you're sitting right now is probably one of the unique examples at this point in the world, at this intersection of music, architectural beauty, advanced technology, and design. This building was created as a hub to share information and to, as Howard so eloquently mentioned earlier, to expand our ways of connecting to audiences, whether that expansion of the connection has to do with new kinds of concert experiences, whether it has to do with getting to know our audiences in a very different way. It's a very intimate kind of hall. Or whether it also has to do with connecting our musicians to some of the leading practitioners and providing them access to excellence. Not only are we sharing with our fellows the opportunity to connect to get ideas from people like the principal bassoonist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, but we're using this as a place to exchange information from our side. That is, we're doing a tremendous amount of teaching in the Miami-Dade area from here, online, as well as on site. And we're also continuing to extend and expand what we're able to do. We are just at the very beginning of exploring the possibilities in this space. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us as we continue this journey forward in the New World Center. Thank you.